Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for turning out in such large numbers for what promises to be a very interesting discussion. My name is David McNeil. I'm an ex-board member of this club and a freelance journalist. Today's speaker is, of course, Natsuo Yamaguchi, the head of New Komeito, or the chief representative, as he likes to describe himself. The main point of interest, I suppose, for journalists, or one of the main points of interest, is the tension between New Komeito, or Komeito now, and the LDP over many issues, including nuclear power and the economy. But it's on the issue of change to Japan's pacifist stance, where the apparent differences between the two parties are strongest. The LDP is challenging the constitutional ban on collective defense, with potentially profound consequences for Asia. Its Buddhist-backed pacifist partner is uneasy with many of the changes that the LDP is proposing. Its supporters call Komeito a break on the LDP's ambitions. Somehow, despite those tensions within the two ruling parties, they have managed to work together now for many years, and despite rumors that they would break up, they have stayed together. Komeito has shifted ground, or many people think it has shifted ground, on self-defense policy without losing the support of its religious followers and the huge pool of voters, something like 8 million, who put its politicians into power. Our speaker, Yamaguchi-sensei, is an ex-lawyer before he went into politics. He's going to talk for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then we'll take questions. Can you give him the best of your attention, please, while he talks? If you have already done so, apologize, but could you switch off your mobile phones? Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much for your kind invitation today. I'm going to begin by explaining some of my thoughts about several topics that were given to me by the FCCJ. First topic that was given to me today was to speak about security issues, in particular the security legislation that is now being deliberated in the Diet. I would like to explain to you our party's fundamental thoughts in regard to this legislation. As you know, Komeito has always taken the tenets of the Constitution very much to heart. It has pursued policies that support the pacifism and the ideals of international cooperation that are expressed in the Constitution. It has also emphasized the need for diplomatic efforts to try to prevent conflicts before they occur. It also has expressed a desire to always support the ideals of the Constitution, which is to contribute to the international community.
という考え方です。
Having said this, however, I would like to be very, very clear. We do not believe in the kind of peace-pursuing policies which are simply words, but we believe that peaceful intentions must be followed by actions. In other words, we want to create a peaceful situation in a very steady and realistic way. In other words, we pursue a peace that is accompanied by action. I would like to emphasize several specific points. One is that we believe that the heart of our security and peaceful cooperation efforts lies in the maintenance of the U.S.-Japan Security Pact. We also believe that we should play a positive role and make contributions to increasing or deepening and strengthening the relationship between countries that are nearby to us, such as China and South Korea and other nations. The third area that we believe in very, very strongly is that as Japan is the only nation that has been the target or the recipient of a nuclear attack, we believe very, very strongly in trying to eliminate nuclear weapons from the earth. We believe that we should not simply just wish this, but we should take a leadership position in trying to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons.
ということです。
We also believe that there are many other kinds of security issues that are very important for humanity, and we believe in people security. What I mean by this is that we believe that we should make contributions to eliminating poverty and starvation, and also the prevention of the spread of dangerous diseases. So it is based on these four principles that I've just described that we have pursued policies that ensure that Japan becomes a more peaceful nation. In particular, in regard to our relationship with China, the Komeito has long maintained a relationship with our counterparts in China, and as a basis of continuous exchanges between members of our government and members of their government, we have been able to build a relationship of mutual trust. In other words, we have been able to pursue a unique policy of maintaining constant dialogue. As you know, at present in the Diet, there's considerable deliberation going on about legislation that has to do with peace and security and safety. And I believe that in the years following the end of the Cold War, we have passed through three historical stages, which has led us to this current situation. At every stage during this past history, the Komeito has always taken a very active, proactive role in contributing to legislation that deals with the different issues of that time. In other words, whether we were a member of the administrative government or whether we were a member of the opposition parties, we have always deeply immersed ourselves in producing legislation that falls within the framework of the existing constitution, but however uses the abilities of the self-defense forces to create a more peaceful world. The first stage following the end of the Cold War is a period that I would describe as being between 1990 and 1993. This was a period when the war saw the eruption of, or the beginning of the eruption of many, many regional conflicts that for many years had sort of stayed below the surface because of the Cold War structure. As these regional conflicts began to appear, the Komeito took a very proactive role in confirming the fundamental tenets of the Constitution. What I mean by this is that it is very, very clearly stated in the Constitution, one of the great principles of the Constitution is that Japan will not take part in armed attacks, or armed force, the use of armed forces, and it will not take actions that are in concert with the armed attacks or armed forces or use of forces by other countries. It was at this time that Japan was able to pass a law that directly translated would be the law to cooperate with peacekeeping, international peacekeeping operations. As this law was formulated, the Komeito took a very strong position ensuring that 5 fundamental important principles were included as part of this act or law. As a result of the passage of this law, until now, until the present day, the self-defense forces have taken part in 13 different activities, and some 10,000 self-defense forces personnel have taken part in these activities. At the time that this law was being deliberated and finally passed, there was a tremendous and vocal movement within Japan. Many people objected to the passage of this law. They were saying that it was violated the Constitution of Japan, and that it would create a situation where Japan would eventually be caught up in armed conflicts and will eventually lead to Japan participating in a war. In fact, the voices against this legislation were even stronger than the voices that we are hearing today. However, over time, we have seen that this PKO law has been widely accepted not only by the people of Japan, but also by the international community. The second stage, historically, that we saw great changes in terms of security legislation was at the beginning of the 21st century. This is when there was legislation passed to deal with contingencies. The reason that this contingencies legislation needed to be realized or needed to be passed was because among the countries in Japan's around Japan's periphery, there was a country that was developing ballistic missiles with the intent, it was assumed, to target in part Japan. As a result, there was a general understanding that the U.S.-Japan Security Pact would have to be strengthened in some way. In other words, the abilities or the functions of the Security Pact would have to be strengthened in some way, and that is why this legislation was passed. At the time of the passage of this contingency legislation, a fundamental decision or a fundamental understanding was reached within the limitations of the Constitution. There were many, many discussions about a constitutional theory at that time. And the fundamental idea that was agreed upon was a principle that if there was some kind of an armed attack or there was an imminent armed attack on Japan's territory or Japan's territorial waters or on Japan's territorial air, space, then Japan would have the right to defend itself using military force. There was also one exception to this rule that was also accepted at that time, which was that on the high seas, if there was an attack or an imminent attack that would eventually be directed against Japan, again, Japan would have the right to defend itself.
同時に
And at the same time, there was a further understanding that was in principle accepted, which was that if this attack or imminent attack in areas on the high seas outside of Japan's immediate territory were not against Japanese forces directly, but against other nations' military forces, but with the intention that eventually that armed attack or armed threat would eventually reach Japan, then Japan again also would have the right to defend itself. Of course, the threats that were considered viable at that time were quite severe, which is why there was so much deliberation and this understanding, these basic principles were finally accepted. However, when we look at the current security environment facing Japan, we see that it has become even harsher and more dangerous than before. The reason I say that is because there have been an increasing number of terrorist attacks which have involved Japanese persons, Japanese citizens. We have also seen the numbers of incursions into Japanese territorial airspace requiring a Japanese aircraft to scramble to meet them. We have seen these incursions increase dramatically in number. We have also seen that some countries, in line with their growing economic might, have begun to increase their military presence in the world. So it is these environmental changes and the need for Japan to be able to respond to these environmental changes in the security situation that has led us to deliberate this current legislation. In other words, what we are aiming to develop is a seamless overall framework or system in which we will be able to prepare ourselves even during peacetime so that we will be able to deal immediately with contingencies if they might arise. It is only through having this kind of seamless security system that we will be able to protect not only the peace and safety of Japan and its Japanese people, but also we will be able to make a significant contribution to the peace and stability of the international community. The Japanese constitution, as many of you are aware, has very specific restrictions on what Japan can and cannot do. So in regard to armed attacks that are directly directed toward Japan, in other words, if Japan is basically defending itself or its own citizens, then Japan does have the right to use military force to protect itself. However, the constitution also very clearly states that we cannot use our military strength to protect other nations. Of course, in regard to the Constitution, I would like to explain how the government views the Constitution, in particular how the government looks at Article 9. Article 9 has several items or clauses beneath it. The first is that Japan renounces war, will not use military force. And the second clause basically says that Japan will never have military forces for either ground forces or maritime forces or air forces. So on the surface, it looks as though Article 9 prevents Japan from having any arms at all. However, the preamble of the Constitution explains that the Japanese people and the Japanese nation have a right to continue to exist in a peaceful way. Also, Article 13 explains that the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as long as it does not interfere with public welfare. In other words, Japan does have the right to engage in armed forces or armed conflict if it is in retaliation or in response to an attempt to take away the human rights of the Japanese people. In other words, in order to eliminate such a threat or such a danger, Japan does have the right to protect itself and therefore to maintain enough forces to be able to defend itself. At the same time, as I mentioned earlier, Article 9 explicitly states that this might or right to defend oneself, the power or abilities to defend oneself, must be kept to a minimum. So, in other words, we do have the ability, we do have the right to defend ourselves, but the ability must be kept to a minimum. I would also like to mention that when we talk about defense and the right to self-defense, there are two kinds of self-defense rights that are existing in international law. One is the right to what we call individual self-defense, the right to defend one's own people in one's own country. And then there is a collective self-defense, which is not only the right to defend one's own country and one's own people, but also the rights and the people and the rights of other nations as well. Having said this, however, in Japan it is very clear. We do have the right to ensure that we can protect ourselves from anyone or any country that tries to take away the Japanese people's human rights. However, in regard to the right to protect the rights of other nations, people of other nations, and the right to protect other countries, although that is respected in international law, according to our Constitution, we do not have that collective defense right. Having said this, however, if the attack on another country acts or can be viewed as the beginning of an armed attack that will eventually be directly affecting Japan, directly affecting the Japanese people in a very serious and important way, in other words, an attack that will eventually harm in great on a great scale, the Japanese people, then Japan would have the right to respond in return. So in that sense, Japan does have, again, in a very limited sense, the right to collective self-defense as well. So I would like to explain, in regard to this limited use of collective self-defense, it is not that you look at a specific case and say that the attack was originally meant for just for a Japanese person or a Japanese group, or whether it was directed toward another country, but whether that attack eventually in some way would harm the human rights of the Japanese people, would have the effect of overturning the fundamental human rights of the Japanese people. If one can look at that situation in an objective manner and make that decision, then Japan does have the right, in this very limited way, to exercise its right to collective self-defense. That has been the consistent view of the Japanese government. I would like to again emphasize the fact that what the kind of thinking that I've just explained to you has been very logically thought out over the years. It is the consistent long-term thinking of the government, and in the future we do not expect this thinking to change. And that is why we are proposing that this be put in the current legislation. In other words, the fears that some people may have that the definition or of the concept of collective self-defense might be expanded eventually in terms of the concept that is widely used in international law. In other words, collective self-defense is widely understood as being the right to defend other nations as well. This complete acceptance of the idea of a wider scope of collective self-defense is not something that Japan can do under its current constitution and under the current interpretation of the constitution. If a larger, expanded understanding of the idea of collective self-defense is to be adopted by Japan, then we believe very strongly, and we have said very strongly, that the constitution would have to be amended. We have spent the past year having 25 joint meetings by the coalition parties, in other words, with our counterparts, the LDP, on this matter. We have also had 35 meetings within the Komeito on this matter. We have discussed this matter thoroughly from every possible point of view, and we have taken our very deepened understanding of this issue before the people of Japan through the Diet deliberations. It is our intention to continue explaining this very complicated and difficult issue in a very clear and understandable way, so that we can gain the people's understanding. Actually, I'd intended to talk about some of the other themes that had been given to me by the FCCJ, which was a constitutional revision and and the tax system and energy policies. However, I am limited for some time, so I'd like to refer to these topics during the question and answer session.
ありがとうございました。
Kind attention.
Thank you, and thank you for sticking to the 30 minutes to allow time for questions. We'll take questions from the working press first. I see Teddy's hand. Can I remind you to state your name and the name of your organization when you reach the microphone? Teddy first, and then Isabel.
Terry Jimbo with the Video News. As a courtesy to the speaker, I'm going to ask questions in Japanese. 日本語で質問します。ビデオニュースのジンボ。
So I'm Jimbo, and I have two questions. First of all, as you know, the House of Representatives asked three constitutional experts to come and speak before one of their subcommittees about and their opinions about the security legislation being deliberated and its constitutionality. And all three of them basically said that the current security legislation being deliberated was in violation of the Constitution. However, Mr. Komura, the vice head of the LDP, said that finally what would be these decisions would be based not on the expertise of constitutional experts, but rather by politicians. You yourself, however, are a lawyer. Do you have the same thinking as Mr. Komura? And just in general, what is your opinion of the views of these three constitutional academics? And secondly, this idea that the security legislation is necessary and special exceptions are made in the case, and the phrase that is being used is that in the case where the very survival of Japan might be threatened. Even if there is a case when the forces of another country are attacked, Japan is not directly attacked, still it seems that there might be possible cases where the survival of Japan might actually be threatened, even if that attacking country has no intention of attacking Japan. Although there have been many deliberations about this, many examples have been given by the government, people have been talking about the cutoff of crude oil supplies or maybe food supplies, still it's very, very difficult for us to understand. What does Komeito think might be an actual situation if you would give one or two specific examples where an armed attack against another country might actually threaten the survival of Japan? So in regard to your first question, I believe, of course, that the opinions of the constitutional experts must be treated with great respect, and we must humbly take their advice or their thoughts as a reference point for our deliberations. Having said this, however, as I mentioned in the Constitution, Article 13 says that the fundamental responsibility for protecting the lives of the Japanese people lies with the government and with the Diet. And as such, it is our responsibility to determine what the fundamental functions of the self-defense forces and the fundamental shape of our international cooperation should be. So it is with that understanding in mind that I've spent some time already describing to you how the government views these issues and how the government views the Constitution. So in regard to your second question, this idea of a threat or a danger that would threaten this very survival of Japan, the most important point, there have been new conditions that have been defined as in this regard. But the most important point to keep in mind is that if there is a fundamental danger or fundamental threat that might fundamentally threaten to overturn the rights of the Japanese people to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If a specific incident occurs that would cause such a danger to be perceived, then we can respond to it. This sounds ambiguous, however, it is not an ambiguous threat. It's very, very specific. It says that if something happens and you can clearly see, it is objectively seen that Japan and its people would have their rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness threatened or overturned, and then we can respond. And I do not think it is necessary or that helpful to give very, very specific examples about what might happen or what might not happen, but rather to take an overall view of what is happening in the world and in the surrounding environment, and to be able to comprehensively look at the potential dangers so that we can prepare for them. That, I think, is the most important thing to keep in mind. And the fundamental idea, again, is that even if an attack is not directly directed toward Japan, if the result of that attack on another force has the similar deep, serious, and disastrous, very large-scale effects on Japan, as almost as if Japan itself were being directly attacked, then that can be considered a measure by which we can move.
Isabel Reynolds from Bloomberg. You mentioned that one important aspect of Japan's security policy is relations with its neighbouring countries. Now, we're coming up to the 50th anniversary of Japan-Korea ties, and I understand there's some debate about whether the Prime Minister should attend a ceremony to mark that occasion at the South Korean embassy. Would you like to see him attend, and what would you like him to say while he's there?
As you've pointed out, this is a very, very important time between South Korea and Japan. These ceremonies that are being planned not only in Tokyo but also in Seoul to commemorate this very important year are both ceremonies that we should watch with great anticipation. I think it would be a very, very opportune time for us to reconfirm on both sides the importance of the histories that we have shared over the past 50 years, and based on confirming the trust that we have with each other and the good relations that we have with each other, to work to strengthen those feelings of trust and good relations, and so that we can move forward together in a positive way towards the future. As I mentioned, there are official ceremonies being held in both countries, in both cities, and if they are official ceremonies, of course, or official events, it is only natural that invitations would be issued. And of course, seeing how the reactions to the different invitations are responded to, I think that it is my great hope that both ceremonies in both countries end up being events that are welcomed and considered successful by the people of both nations.
Do you think that the Prime Minister should apologize for the war?
Prime Minister Abe has made it clear that he has intended to continue in the footsteps of his predecessors, previous prime ministers and previous cabinets, in regard to their views about the war. In other words, he is respecting the previous statements that have been made by previous prime ministers and cabinets. And I believe that he is consistent in his beliefs and his statements. Of course, there are many it has been stated that he might likely issue some kind of a statement to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the ending of the war. But in regard to when he might issue such a statement and what the contents might be, there has not been anything yet determined, to the best of my knowledge. Having said this, however, until now, I have listened to the statements that have been made by Prime Minister Abe, and he has made it very, very clear that in regard to the actions of Japan before World War II, he feels deep remorse. In other words, the Japanese words are fukaku hansei shiteiru, and it's on the basis of feeling this deep remorse that Japan has been able to build over the past 70 years a peaceful path towards a better future, and that is the path that he tends to follow in the future as well. I think he has been very, very consistent in all of his statements until now.
And to see with Reuters, I'd like to go back to the question of the security legislation. You mentioned that one thing that was very important was to keep explaining to the public so that they would understand the need for the legislation. Opinion polls consistently show that a vast majority of people say the explanation has not been sufficient, that there's a division among voters who see it as necessary or unnecessary, but there seems to be a fairly large majority that see no particular need to pass it in this session of Parliament. Parliament appears to be going to be extended at least until some point in August, but do you think it's absolutely necessary to pass this legislation in the current session of Parliament, or is it possible to continue to explain it to the public to seek further understanding?
As you know, the Diet is still currently in its session, and as the member of the government and the ruling parties, we have decided in advance that we would do our very best to ensure the passage of this legislation during this current session. We have understood that this would be a very, very difficult task. But because we have set this task before us from the beginning, we believe that we have the responsibility to see it through to the very end. Having said this, we understand, and we have understood from the very beginning, that this is a legislation that is very, very deep in nature in terms of contents, and that the contents also are very, very wide-ranging, and therefore it is not something that you can immediately understand in just one hearing or just listening or studying briefly about this. In other words, we knew from the very beginning beginning that because it was such wide-ranging and complex and difficult legislation, that we would have to repeatedly explain to the public in a very, very careful and understandable way in order to gradually, over time, be able to get the understanding of the people. And so we do, again, as I said earlier, intend to see it through to the end. We do wish to gain the understanding of the people and to pass it in this current session.
I think Linda's point might have been the more that you explain, the less people seem to understand. Is that what you were kind of saying? Oh, I'm sorry. That's me reading into your question. Sorry about that.
I believe what is necessary is that we have an opportunity to go back to the basics, explaining this legislation from the very, very beginning. In other words, recently I've been watching the media, and of course you've been watching the Diet deliberations, and it seems that the discussions have focused on just certain aspects of this very, very large piece of legislation. And the specific small aspects that are being focused upon are given much more coverage and much more attention so that one cannot see the overall whole. I think it is important that we take the opportunity and try to gain the understanding of the public by going back to the original intent behind our proposing this legislation, to try to give an idea of the overall structure of the legislation and also explain very carefully to the public what kind of safeguards or what kind of checks are included in the overall legislation to ensure that things do not go too far. In other words, we have to continue to provide information in a very understandable way.
Michael, first, and can I ask everybody, we're into the last 10 minutes, so can you keep your questions short if possible? Thanks.
Michael Penn of the Shingetsu News Agency. In March of 2003, there was a threat which was portrayed as an existential threat to the international community, which was the weapons of mass destruction possessed by the regime of Saddam Hussein. And on the basis of this existential threat, much of the US and its allies, including Japan, supported an attack on that country, even though it was not supported by the United Nations. And in fact, I remember that the most critical voice in Japan against France was that time Deputy Chief Cabinet Secretary Shinzo Abe. My question to you is, if we don't understand what happened in the past, how can we protect ourselves in the future? The Japanese government, even until now, has never allowed an independent and full investigation of its own policy-making process in regard to the support of the Iraq War. Wouldn't it be a good opportunity to do that now, to make sure that in the future there isn't some threat that is portrayed as existential, which is not actually existential?
At the time, the thinking in Japan was as that not whether or not to support or not support the Iraq War, but rather Japan made the decision based on a resolution passed by the United Nations to help offer support in terms of the humanitarian and reconstructive work in Iraq. As a member of the United Nations, it felt that it had a responsibility to offer humanitarian and reconstruction support. That is why the self-defense forces were sent to part of Iraq. I would like to make it very clear, however, that Japan did not take part in any kind of armed conflict in the war, and it did not provide logistical or rear support to the armed forces there. And in regard to your suggestion that one looks back over past policies and try to learn from past policies, certainly I do not deny that that is a very useful activity. But at the same time, I would like to again repeat that Japan did not take part in armed attacks, and it did not provide logistical support. It took part in what was sanctioned by the United Nations, the idea of providing humanitarian reconstruction support. And I would also like to add that the work of the self-defense forces in that regard were highly regarded by the international community. And I would also like to explain that we have learned from the bitter lessons of the past. At the time of the Iraq War, our activities were sanctioned by the passage of a special measures law. However, special measures laws are things that you have to deliberate each and every time. And so in order to counter some of the difficulties of handling special measures laws or passing special measures laws, we've decided to improve on this process by passing a permanent law this time. And having, however, proposed this permanent legislation, we have ensured that there are three prerequisites for being able to provide a logistical support. And one is that it must be an action that is condoned by the international community, in other words, by the United Nations. And secondly, that we must have prior approval of the Japanese Diet. And thirdly, that the security or the safety of the self-defense personnel, self-defense forces personnel must be secured on the responsibility of the Minister of Defense. And specifically what I mean by that is that the self-defense forces personnel will only be sent to areas where it is not predicted that any armed conflict will arise.
Thank you. Well, I am tempted to take one more question, but we have been told to wind up at exactly at exactly 4 o'clock. So, with apologies to people who still have their hands up, we'll wind up there. Can you please show your appreciation to Mr. Yamaguchi for coming and explaining his policies and being so forthright, and also to the wonderful Takamatsu-san who had to explain all that in English. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Can I just remind you, first of all, that 2 of the 3 scholars who disagreed with the interpretation, the government's interpretation of the Constitution, will talk here on Monday. Is that right, Chung-san? Monday, next Monday, that is. So if you're interested in a bun fight, come along to that. And can I also remind you, please, to stay seated until Mr. Yamaguchi leaves the room. Thank you.